Hey folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. I'm excited, so excited to be here today with Evan Owens, who is, I don't know if the founder of Reboot Recovery. It is a program that is designed to help with first responders and people in our military to deal with trauma. I've been part of and been associated around this program for, golly, probably what, about 10 years, Evan, you think? It's
Yeah,
been.
almost. Yeah, eight or so. Yeah, it's getting close.
Yeah. And it was outstanding. So I met Evan through a mutual friend of ours, and we sat down and talked, and he told me about the program, and he brought a graduate from the program with him, and it was just overwhelmingly just so impressed. And the more I've kind of watched him grow this program, make it into a national just phenomenon. And now so Evan, I'll let you talk about it because this just, again, it's so incredible. I want people to see it. I want to kind of hear about how it's grown a little bit.
Yeah.
So first of all, welcome to the show, and then just tell us about yourself and how you got into this program.
Yeah. Well, it's this is amazing. Any chance I get to steal airtime and share our heart and passion for this, we're always going to take it. And I feel like you never know, first off, who's listening. So I always start off by saying, maybe you hear some of what I say and it resonates with your story, and you say, "Hey, I need some help." You can sign up for a course at rebootrecovery.com. Or if you are listening today and you say, "Hey, I've walked through some crises and some traumas with other people, and I want to know how to help them," I hope that I can share some stuff for you as well. And so, yeah, my really short version of my story: my wife and I have been married almost 20 years now, which is amazing. She was working way back in 2010. She was working for the Department of Defense. She had gotten recruited to go build the first traumatic brain injury clinic of its kind on Fort Campbell, which is a military base for the Army, one of the largest bases in the country. And at the time, I was the CEO of a technology company. And one day she said, "I want to invite some former patients, some people that are live right near our home over for dinner. Can you come home a few minutes early for dinner?" Well, I said yes. And anybody who knows what it's like when you are trying to get out of the office on time, the day you actually have to leave at time, you're always late, right? You're always late. So I'm rushing home. And by the time I got there, they had already just sort of, I could sense that the conversation, it was just three people, my wife and myself. And I could tell that the conversation had shifted from small talk into conversations about where faith and trauma collide in their life. We talked about guilt and shame and regret and loss and identity and all these deep things. In a lot of ways, um, drudged up things that I had not really thought about, that I realized, hey, um, I need to explore in my own life as well, because I had sort of been successful enough in my career that I felt like if I was big enough and strong enough and fast enough and good enough, that I wouldn't have to ever deal with these things. But yet, as I sat and listened to these stories, it, a lot of various things came up in my life. And so um, it was the next day, I went to work. Um, and it was as if overnight my appetite for the company that I had been building was gone. It was a very surreal experience. Um, and I was being asked to basically like walk through life when I had just experienced the thrill of sprinting for the first time. And I just wanted to sprint. I didn't want to walk anymore. So I came home and I told my wife that. And amazingly, she was like, "Evan, I feel the same." So for the next 5 years, we met on Fort Campbell, the military base, which I can talk about, but we also met all over in various places throughout Middle Tennessee, usually 2 to 3 times a week for 5 years. We got the opportunity to hear hundreds and hundreds of stories from people who had gone through traumas and learned what worked for them and what didn't and what was most helpful, and then backed it all up with some of our experiences and our expertise, and thus birthed Reboot. And it was a hilarious thing I'll never forget. On the way up to our very first meeting with some of the higher ups for the Army, they said, "What's your program called?" And my wife said, "It's called Evan and Jenny's House on Monday nights," because on an agenda, we didn't have a plan. And but sometimes, when you have um, I think when you're meeting such a necessary need, the challenge is not necessarily trying to market it and grow it. The challenge, I think, actually becomes just not getting in its way and letting the movement become what it was meant to be. And that's really been our heart and passion since 2016 when we both quit our jobs and went from dual income and no kids to three kids and very little income. And we've been doing that ever since.
So when you're talking about trauma, obviously, again, you're on Fort Campbell, home of several units. Probably the most well known would be the 101st Airborne. You're dealing with trauma. I'm assuming you're dealing with the trauma of many of the people at that time, originally, of many of the people that were returning from war, and had it was mostly physical and emotional trauma, or was it just primarily one or the other?
Yeah, I think at the time they were being told that everything they were struggling with was mental and physical. But I think the thing that we began to realize and ask a lot of questions is that I think everyone, regardless of their faith background, will to some degree contend that we're made up of a mind, body, and a soul, or a mind, body, and a spirit. And yet, when asked the question, can trauma wound your mind and body? The answer is unequivocally yes, of course. And people can rattle off all these ways, all these symptoms that you might experience. But then if you ask a person, can trauma wound your soul as well? All of a sudden there's this pause and you say, okay, well, what would the symptoms of a wounded soul be? And this really opened the door for us to have conversations, to look at trauma through a lens that is really quite different than what mental health traditionally views it as. And sort of our definition of trauma is when your life personally intersects with the brokenness of the world. Therefore, recovery is when your life personally intersects with the redemptive heart of God. And so that's sort of what our definition is. But this idea of was it a mind wound or a body wound? I would argue that yes, but it was also a soul wound, and that um, there were these questions about guilt and shame, and questions about why did this happen to this person, and why is this still going on? These are really um, spiritual questions, I think, at their core, because they're really sort of looking to a divine presence for answers. And so we were able to have open conversations with majority of people that did not share our worldview, and that continues to this day. And we can talk a little bit about what we've done since 2016, but yeah, that was sort of the origin of it.
Okay, so when define trauma for me again, because I like the way you defined it. I've never heard it defined quite that way. So define that for me one
Yeah.
more
Our
time.
definition is it's your personal intersection with the brokenness of the world, because my worldview says that um, we were created to exist in a world without trauma. So if you look back, not to get preachy, but if you look back, Adam and Eve, the minute that sin entered the world, they experienced the first trauma. They were actually separated from God, but in that moment, also additionally, you can see they experienced shame for the first time. They experienced loneliness for the first time. They had pain for the first time. And all of those things combined with suddenly being found naked, I would imagine would be fairly traumatic for a person who knew no evil up until that point. They were safe, they had purpose, and they had belonging. And yet, following that exact moment, they lost safety. They had to work for their purpose, and they no longer belonged. And so I think all of us, in our world, sometimes that happens for us gradually over a lifetime of trauma, sort of the rose-coloredness fades. But others of us, I think, can pinpoint the exact moment that the glasses became clear and we realized that we could see that this world was not as it was meant to be. And that is trauma. The clinical definition of trauma is witnessing or experiencing a devastating or deeply disturbing event. And we believe both of those are good working definitions.
Well, but and by the way, the never really thought of Adam and Eve having trauma. It's just one of those things, as you read the story of Adam and Eve, and you can kind of
Right,
judge them from a 21st century, looking back on
right,
it. And I
right.
wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have let Eve do it. I would, when we would have. Um, but I never thought about that being traumatic. But I love the way you phrase that, because I think you're exactly correct. But that leads me thinking about, okay, in this situation, especially you're dealing with soldiers returning again from combat, who have had
Right.
and a lot of times I'm certain physical trauma as well. When you're
Correct.
dealing with that, and they start asking those why questions, that that's where they're recognizing the brokenness of the world the way that Adam and Eve did. Is that kind of how you're
Right. They've
framing
they've
that up?
personally experienced it now. And in
Right.
some times, depending on their story, they might have had to perpetrate what they now perceive as wrong or evil. Not in many cases, but in some cases. Or they witnessed things that were wrong and evil and they were unable to bring about justice. War is it's not all that it's not all so altogether different from the rest of humanity's experience. The difference is that it's amplified. Everything good and bad is amplified, and the volume's turned up to 15. Friendship, camaraderie, brotherhood, love, trust is amplified to 15. Equally, violence, evil, deceit, deception, betrayal is turned up to 15. And so all of a sudden you have these your life, if throughout your whole life, let's say you're a sponge and you're absorbing all of these life experiences, some good and some bad, when trauma intersects our life, all of a sudden it's like a sponge being squeezed, and all of a sudden these things will start coming out of us emotionally, mentally, spiritually, out of our mouth, out of our minds, even physically, that we always were able to sort of keep at bay, but now put in the pressure cooker of war, and in the aftermath of it, a lot comes out. And I think that's where a lot of the people that came to our programs early in those early days, they were experiencing fruit on their tree, if you will. But they weren't necessarily connecting it to a root. They were busy basically playing whack-a-mole with their symptoms. And as soon as they could find one medication to treat one symptom, they would instantly find that that medication or therapy caused a different symptom, and they found themselves chasing these symptoms. And I think they found themselves very exhausted and believing a lot of lies around their identity, lies that trauma will tell all of us eventually, if left untreated. And I think we start to believe that our best days are in the past. We start to believe that um, we're a burden instead of a blessing to other people because we're not able to heal. We start to believe through comparison that other people who were stronger, smarter would be handling it better than we are. We start to, and these lies start to sort of um, infect us. And I think that's for all of humanity. But in the military, it happens at a very fast and very sudden speed due to the intensity of the experience.
You know, I one of the things that we make fun of the medicine of colonial times when they would get leeches to put on an infection, and then the swelling
Yeah,
would go down because it would suck the blood out, and so but the patient would still die because it didn't treat the underlying cause.
correct.
And this, it sounds like to be the same thing, but instead of us, we're doing the same thing now. We're just doing it in a more sophisticated manner than what happened then. So when I'm hearing this and I'm seeing this from it, one of the things I think you said, someone came, who was it that came to you and said, "Hey, what's the name of your ministry?" That your wife was like, "Hey, it's our house." Like, who was it that approached you with that?
Yeah, so we had been meeting in our house for about a year and a half, and word started to spread so much among some of the infantry guys and some of the people in the WTB, the Warrior Transition Battalion, that there was a guy named Mike, and I won't share his last name just so he's not in trouble, but there was a guy named Mike who was very high ranking and who oversaw what was called the Soldier Family Assistance Center, which was a building specifically designed to be a one-stop shop for injured active duty service members and their families to be able to identify resources needed to transition out. He happened to be a person who was looking at the existing treatment and realizing that um, there was a gap. There was a gap. And the biggest gap was not just the soul wound piece, but also the peer to peer piece, this idea of authentic community being the bedrock of mental health. Yes, we've learned a lot about the brain on one hand. On the other hand, we still know hardly anything about the brain. And when we look at the science of the last really 40, 50 years of psychology, um, about every 50 years, there's this aha moment that, well, we've been doing some things right and we've been doing some things wrong, and new manuals come out, new education. But I think that throughout all of it, if you look at one of the things that studies have continually time and time again showed is the leading indicator of whether a person will demonstrate long-term resilience and health, regardless if it's trauma or um, schizophrenia or depression or bipolar disorder or whatever. It's not clinical care. It's not medication. It's not inpatient versus outpatient. It's actually their level at which they participate in loving, trusting, authentic relationship. How well do they belong? And do they feel like they have a community of people that empathize with them and love them in spite of what they're going through? And I think that's what we really tapped into, is that Jenny and I, we were less leaders and we were more like um, maybe more like gatherers of like-minded people to be able to say, see, all of you all are in a similar boat. Let's realize that we're not, alone in this.
The Demas's family has been in the restaurant business for many generations. We have been serving people in the Middle Tennessee market for 34 years. Try our spaghetti kits, our pot roast, which we slow cook for 4 hours, or our world famous baked chicken and rice soup, which many locals have dubbed Greek penicillin for when you feel under the weather. We make our food fresh, and upon placing our order with us, we freeze the order and send it to your house. Demas's is more than a business. 5 generations of restaurant operators have taught us many things about food, but more importantly, we have recognized that we don't sell food. We sell the experience of bringing people and families together, which our country desperately needs. So go to demasfamilykitchen.com and share in this journey today. And for right now, use the code UNCOMMON to get 10% off of your order. That's demasfamilykitchen.com.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
was sort of.
I guess I find it interesting that it wasn't like the chaplains there that recognized it. It wasn't like, from a a spiritual wound or a spiritual healing. I find that interesting that that wasn't them.
Yeah, and
Um,
actually, to this day, most of our referrals come from secular sources, and a lot
wow.
of our referrals come from secular sources. And I think that's partly because of the way we've designed the program. We never wanted to be a program that was by church people for church people,
Right.
exclusive to church people, and because regardless if you leave with a Christian worldview or not, when you finish our program or when you enter it, there are universal truths that we teach that are true because true is true, period.
Yeah.
And let me give you one. You asked what is trauma. Trauma is, our word trauma actually comes from a Greek word, the same exact Greek word. The word trauma is a Greek word that literally just means wound. That's what the word trauma means, and that's where we get it. And yet, when we look at trauma, it's this giant, scary, complicated mental health disorder that needs complicated care and medicine. But in its truest form, trauma is a wound. And this is a fundamental shift for people who have believed because of what happened to me, I am now broken. I'm a broken person. Well, brokenness is a difficult thing to remedy. But when you start saying you're not broken, you're wounded, and wounds can heal if proper steps are taken, all of a sudden now there's a way forward. All of a sudden now I can start asking how questions and when questions about my process as opposed to why questions, which may not have answers this side of heaven. And this is my point is take all the Jesus out of this, take any church context or religious context out of this. That's still a true statement and still a very encouraging and helpful kind of mind frame and mental structure with which to start moving forward following devastating life experiences. And so that's what we find. A lot of people, they get just as much out of it regardless of their worldview, and we like it that way, because it enriches all of our experiences. All of us are better by having relationships with people that are a little bit different than us.
So this starts off, it starts to grow. People are talking about it. More people are coming. You recognize, hey, this is something that we have
Yeah.
to do. So kind of the next kind of growth spurt, because with every business, every organization, as long as it grows and scales, it's never gradual. It's either it booms and then plateaus and then booms and plateaus.
So true. That is so
Yes. So,
true.
and most of the plateauing is us trying to figure out how to catch up to the boom.
Yeah, yeah. Or
So
we've screwed something up and we have to fix it now. That's definitely the
I thought that
truth.
was only me that screwed things up like that. I'm glad to
100%.
know
No,
it's you
no,
too.
yeah. Yeah. I feel like the trick for me has just been I have to be right a little bit more often than I'm wrong. Like as long as I'm at the 53% mark, we're probably going to grow. But yeah, so in 2016, we both quit our jobs. We released our first military curriculum, our actual first curriculum called, at the time it was called Reboot Combat Recovery. Today it's just called Military Reboot. And uh, the vision was simply this. It was the vision that we felt like we had was to mobilize the largest peer-led response to trauma and suicide that had ever been built. And the way we would do that is by empowering people closest to the problem. And so we didn't want to say, hey, Evan and Jenny have cracked the code. If you need help, come to Tennessee and we're going to get you fixed up. We wanted to say, no, 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 we'll empower. There's got to be a lot of Evan and Jenny's out there who want to do more than running a 5K or playing a golf tournament to help veterans. They actually want to be a part of the solution. Not that there's anything wrong with running 5Ks and playing in golf tournaments. I want to make sure that I say that. I'm glad people do that. But the point is, they wanted to be a part of the actual boots on the ground solution. They wanted to find from their own life experiences purpose in their pain, and they wanted to share that. And so these people who had lived it, learned from it, and could lead others out of it, we wanted to mobilize them. The other thing that we saw that turned out to be drastically true, and we didn't know it at the time. This is one of the big guesses that we were right in, was that we didn't know our nation would eventually face a pandemic. We also didn't know that our nation would face a massive shortage of counselors as everyone started to, similar to having a Netflix membership, it seems like everyone now has a professional therapist. And so this has become sort of a thing that's almost a still, of course you're going to have that bill. Of course you're going to have that counselor that you keep on a regular basis. And that was not the case even 10 years ago. So much so that in 2016, when we started launching peer-led courses, we would speak at conferences and literally be condemned. We were told we were reckless, we were irresponsible, people were gonna die because how could someone who, after all, I'm Dr. So-and-so and I went to school for 350 years to learn how to help people. You don't have a clue what you're doing. Your leaders don't know what you're doing. You're going to just hurt people. And yet somehow more and more leaders started coming to us expressing an interest. And so within the first 2 years, I think by 2018, we had, I don't know, 70 or 80 military course locations around the US, all of them led by local people who had a heart. And we were doing the coaching and the curriculum and the help to make sure they could thrive in their local community. And then tragically, there was a shooting at a nightclub in Orlando, Florida called the Pulse nightclub. And we had a military group not far from there that was able to respond, and we were able to help a lot of those first responders. And we came back and I said, man, we've got to do something for first responder community. And so in 2018, we actually joined forces with another nonprofit that was called Branches of Valor, that was ran by Chris and Ranella Adsit out of Oregon, people that Jenny and I had looked up to and still look up to our whole lives. And so they joined our staff at Reboot, joined our team, and we released our first responder reboot program. And it began to grow. And then in 2020, so by this point, we had about 150 programs between the two locations, we call them, where the courses are hosted around the country. But in 2020, when COVID hit, we were meeting and I said, it seems like people are going to respond poorly to this. And we looked at the data and we identified some default responses that happen when trauma happens in our lives that often, if intentionality is not applied, it make things worse instead of better. And we said, hey, if you're going through something difficult right now in light of this COVID thing, maybe you've lost a loved one, maybe your political unrest is stressing you out, maybe you can't get into your doctor, maybe you're just isolated, whatever it is, here's things not to do. And we put it out on the web to see what would happen. And it was the worst, lowest grade created thing that we'd ever released. I filmed it on my iPhone by myself one night, and everything's been different ever since, man. I mean, it was, I got a phone call from the White House, got to brief the White House, got to work with Health and Human Services. We were on all these news stations. We ended up releasing a full-length curriculum called Trauma Reboot, which is trauma healing for anyone. We wrote a book called Healing What's Hidden. Go buy it on Amazon because it's on sale right now for only $8.95 end of the week. So on Amazon, it's Healing What's Hidden. And that book ended up getting picked up. We ended up going on tour with this mega Christian artist named Brandon Lake and a guy named Blessing Offer. And we got to go on tour and speak every night to 7, 10, 8,000, whatever it was, people. And I think today we have 400 and some odd locations, 14 or 15 countries, 4 languages, 46 states, 45 states, sorry, 45 states. And every week, the biggest thing is that nearly 1,500 people volunteer to lead a course every single week. And so our staff is only 15 people big. We're not trying to build this massive organization. We're trying to fulfill our vision of mobilizing a movement. And I think those two things are different.
So
And
even
so
though your staff is small, though, I mean, the way it's growing is you utilize the graduates of your program to move from there. Is that right?
that's correct. Yep. And so 43% of graduates express an interest to stay involved as a volunteer. And this year we're on pace to have over 7,000 people graduate. So that'll mean, we're going to have, now that doesn't mean all of that 43% become leaders. I just want to be
Right.
clear. Some of them are not quite ready yet. They need to go through the program or they need to go to our aftercare model. Um, but but I think we start off with the premise that everyone is a leader from the first week. I don't think that we view it as leaders and participants as much as we start with the premise that every person is a leader. Um, in some capacity, that might be that they lead by being the first to show vulnerability in a moment of intensity. It might be that they lead by setting up chairs and staying late or staying early, coming early, whatever it is. And so I think when you treat people like leaders and you treat them like they matter, as opposed to the great answer, we have the answer, we're the answer. I think people tend to rise to the occasion, and that's what we're seeing is really giving agency to those individuals, but also um, empowering them, not viewing them as people that need help, but actually viewing them as people that soon will be able to help others. And that's a
Right.
massive shift from traditional nonprofit thinking.
Absolutely. Well, and I guess that really is because I've dealt with a lot in the nonprofit world. That's huge. And I would imagine that I mean, you're dealing with people who are um, traditionally between first responders, between military, among those groups, you're dealing with people who are at least seen as, I mean, these are the ones that are they're the tough ones. They're the ones standing in the way, protecting me, protecting you. So like we have that thought process of that they can't be hurt unless we hear kind of the extreme stories, or we hear like the numbers of
Right.
suicides among our military. We hear a
Right.
lot of that. But when I see that, I would imagine that they have that own perception, and as a result, they have a hard time starting that first step of admitting that they have a problem. And I get it, whether it's a problem or not. I don't know how, again, whether they admit that, whether they can be vulnerable, whether they can be that, because I would imagine that would be the hardest thing for someone in that. I know it's hard for me, and
Yeah.
I've not been trained the way they've been trained.
Right.
To
Right.
deal
Right.
with
Right. I mean, think
what
about when
goes
most
with
of
that.
them, when a lot of them joined. I mean, literally the slogan was an army of one, right?
Oh,
It
that's
was
true. Yeah.
meant to appeal to the individualistic attribute of you're a soldier, you're an airman, you're a corpsman, whatever it is. Um, and so, yes, I mean, it is, I feel like we have a special grace in our life to be pretty non-judgmental. I think that's something that my wife and I have, and that we say that somewhat seriously and somewhat jokingly. In the early days, I mean, the number of times that people would sleep during our group or would come in angry and sit in the back with sunglasses on. We had people who would show up in their pajamas. We had people who would show up completely drunk just to prove a point of how stupid it was that they were being dragged there by their loved ones. Um, but I
Huh.
think that, one of the things that I've learned over the years is, if you walk up next to somebody and you just sit by them long enough, um, week in and week out, and you love them, and there's no money in it for you, there's no glory in it for you, there's really no reason that you're there for them other than that you're there for them. I think that breaks down a lot of walls, especially in a veteran and first responder community, especially veterans, where there's a lot of money to be made by helping wounded poor veterans and parading them around and treating them like they're in a zoo or in a fishbowl and saying, look at the ways we're helping these amazing heroes. And I think when you are able to show them that you're not trying to build something on their backs, you're actually saying, no, we want you to be a part of building something, that you're a leader in it. That's a dramatic shift in the conversation, because again, it doesn't start from this mindset of you're broken and you're damaged goods. It starts from the thing is, hey, you have a wound. I mean, nobody would parade someone around and say, man, this person, they're just so broken because they broke their leg, right? But yet we do when it comes to wounds of the heart or of the soul. And I think that just as there's no shame in going and getting your leg set and a cast put on it, there's no shame in seeking help for the wounds of the heart and soul. And I think that's been the beauty of it. I also, just one other point I have to say, I think that generally, here's what I've come to the conclusion of in movements. And I would love to speak in a minute about the difference. I think there's probably some business people who listen to this. I would like to talk a little bit about the difference between movements and organization at some
Yeah,
point in the
yeah,
conversation. Because I keep using this word movement, and I'm not sure people really know what I mean by that. I think they think that's like a buzz term. But but I've come to believe that, especially when it comes to movements, that leaders are highly overrated, that I'm super overrated as the executive of Reboot. Because if it were me sitting in a room, there's two schools of thought. One is you build it around the person, you build it around their story and their fame and their sort of mystique. And that's a lot of military nonprofits. That's why every SEAL has a nonprofit now that they've built, right? Nothing wrong with that. I got a lot of friends that do that, but their entire nonprofit basically stems off of them, their story, their celebrity, their identity. And that can work for them. But the problem is it's very hard to multiply that on a local level because that person can only be in so many places. And I
right.
think when Jesus left and he gave people the Holy Spirit, he basically said, "Good luck, it's in your hands." And he put it in the hands of seemingly unqualified people. And that's a pretty important thought. And so leaders are overrated because ultimately, Jesus, if no one ever followed Jesus, he would have just been this crazy guy claiming to be the Son of God. But what happened was some first followers validated him by following him. And once he had some followers, all of a sudden other people were like, well, I know Peter, I know James, I know John, I know Zebedee, I know the Sons of Thunder, I know these characters. So because of that, now I trust their judgment. And because I trust their judgment, I'll trust Jesus's judgment as well. And so in those early days with Jenny and I, if it was just up to Jenny and I to meet, it was those three people in the living room who invited their friends, who invited their friends. It was never that they trusted Jenny and I. It's still really not. It's that someone who loves them enough, someone that they already have a relationship with, validates us. And I think this principle of the first follower is what creates flywheel growth and expansion and scale that isn't possible if the answer was Jenny and me. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. So
Yeah.
so when you're looking at, the fact that you're bringing them on with the mindset of you're going to be helping be part of the solution, as opposed to we're helping you because we're just so good and we're going to help you in that way, and they're going to be part of the solution. Do you think it's that piece that helps them overcome their trauma because they feel like they're contributing? And then which also is the second question: do you actually ever overcome the trauma, or do you just learn how to handle the trauma? You take whichever question you want on that. It just kind of hit me as I said that one out
Yeah,
loud.
the first one was why or is
Like
it
what?
because we view them as leaders that maybe helps them be able to overcome? I think that's a piece of it. I think every person who you give dignity to is going to rise higher than a person who's seen as in need of your welfare and in need of your help permanently. I think when we can give dignity to people, um, the restoration process has an opportunity to stick. Um, but number two is I don't think there's a better vehicle for healing than community. And I feel like this is where myself and traditional therapists don't see necessarily eye to eye. I love traditional therapy. I love cognitive processing and EMDR and prolonged exposure and all these great things. I'm for all of those. I want to get that in the record. But I also believe that the truth is that clinicians are unable to love their patients in the same way that a community can. And I think a lot of clinicians would agree with me on that. They have too many patients. There's quotas to meet. There's billing. There's processing. There's, et cetera. And the truth is the minute that the billing runs out, they can't continue to love you. A
Right.
community can. And so I think what I think really makes a difference for people truly is that for a lot of them, their ability to contribute in their mind has been taken away. And when they find out that people love them, not because of what they're bringing to the table, not because of what they're doing, but just because of who they are, I think it's a revolutionary thing for people. They've always been, I am loved because I can fill in the blank. And then all of a sudden, well, I can't do that anymore because of my injury, and now I'm unlovable. But then here comes this group of people being like, no, 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 you're just as lovable. It's like, I am. And I think that, you know, also, we've talked a lot about military, but I mean, generically speaking, most enlisted service members that we've worked with, a lot of them, their first trauma was not their combat experience.
Right, right, right.
Yeah.
Usually
That,
was earlier, right? I'm assuming like growing
much
up. Yeah.
Yeah, much earlier. So that leads to the second question is, do you overcome it? Yeah, I believe that trauma healing ends in empowerment. Empowerment to help others while your story is still being written. And there's nothing more beautiful and actually more impactful than a person who's actually still in the process of climbing out of the valley, um, than a person who stands. This is what we tend to do as leaders and church people, especially. We stand on top of the dock while someone is drowning, and we toss them a book that's called Learn How to Swim. And um, and we say, man, read that book, it's going to help you. And we walk back to our cars and go home, get some pot roast, um but that was a weird thing. I don't know why. Pot roast sounds delicious right now, but anyway, so the point is I think that when someone else is saying, hey, I'm in this water with you, but I know how to swim to safety, follow me, that's a shifting thing. So yes, I do believe people overcome trauma, and I believe they do it by letting that trauma transition into from trash to recycled material in their life, recycled material that has purpose and has a meaning that can better their lives, their generational patterns and their kids' lives, but also their community around them.
All right, I'm going to have you, and I know this is going to be the third time, but I'm going to have to ask you to define trauma again because because it ties in with something you just said. So I want to get that fresh definition, make certain I'm not messing the definition up before I ask the next question.
The personal intersection with the brokenness of the world.
Okay, so when you talk about empowerment now as a critical component to helping overcome trauma,
Yeah.
if once you recognize the brokenness of the world, is the empowerment over the brokenness, or is that
Actually, so
kind of
recovery is what you're describing.
okay?
Recovery is your personal intersection with the redemptive heart of God. And why that is, we believe in a principle. There's a verse that a lot of people love to quote, which is, God, I have come to make all things new. And there's this idea, but notice that verse doesn't say I've come to make all new things. And that's
Yeah,
an that's a fascinating turn of phrase. He doesn't say that he's come to make all new things. He's not just in the business of replacement. He's in the business of restoration. In fact, so much so that there's actually he promises throughout scripture that there's actually beauty in the ashes. There's beauty in the restoration that can't be gotten to, can't be accessed without first the damaging process needed to then facilitate the restoring process. And so there's something about our culture. We love house flipping shows and renovations and all this stuff, except for when it comes to our lives, and I think that we want our lives to be like these shows where in 30 minutes or less, our whole life is flipped over and it's all better and everything's cosmetically good. But the truth is, it's more like rebuilding our lives brick by brick. And over time, that 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 story of a personal intersection with the redemptive, keyword there being redemptive heart of God, is to be able to say, wait, Evan, you're telling me that my trauma could ultimately be redeemed. It could be redeemed for something, redeemed like a coupon code that's going to be able to have purpose and is going to somehow bring about hope. And when you say that to people who are in the thick of it, they're like, get out of here. But after you start logically walking through it, and there's a promise that actually it can be redeemed and it can be recycled and repurposed, all of a sudden this dramatically has a revolutionary mind frame shift from this is something broken that I just need to endlessly process to now, wait a minute, I'm looking for the recyclable material here. I'm looking for what can I pull out that's not going to just bless me, but bless others. And that's the most beautiful thing to watch a person traverse through. It's like there's nothing like it. It's like because it's so right. It's right, and And when people hear me talk about it or when they see it, it's like there's a bell that goes off inside of them that's like, wait a minute, that's how it's meant to be. Not this other model of nonprofit where it's like a race to the bottom of how bad this person's life is and guilting you into giving. It's more saying like this person's experiencing redemption and, you know,
In Acts 5, we see that when Peter and the other disciples were ordered to stop talking about Jesus, they responded, "We obey God and not man." In 2020, we saw something we never thought we could see in this country. They shut down our churches. After decades of removing God from schools and public institutions, they went straight at our community. Unfortunately, we as Christians did not know what to do, and even worse, we chose to listen to false prophets masquerading as Christians on how to respond. I recognize this is the only beginning, and we need to know how to respond. We have a duty to say no to unjust laws, but as Christians, we have a greater duty to God. In my book on the duty of Christian civil disobedience, I use biblical teachings to help believers know when and how to stand up to those in charge when they ask us to commit evil. You can go to peterdemas.org to find out about our duty to say no. And when you type in the code UNCOMMON, you can get 10% off your order. That's uncommon at peterdemas.org. Remember, we are to obey God and not man.
What's interesting is, recently for obviously Evan knows this, but he invited me among a group of other people to do a tour of Fort Campbell, and then afterward we kind of talked a little bit more about Reboot, and what was, I didn't pick it up until you're just saying this now, that it was a lot different than, you're right, going to one of these places where they're just talking about how broken everybody is and crying, and you're right, you feel guilty, and I give out of guilt more than, and I'm like, yeah, I care for these people and may not be guilty of it, but there's also like, I feel bad for them as opposed to that. But I'd walked away, and you had a graduate there to speak, and he told his
right.
story, and it is, his story has just resonated in me, but it was a story of hope and encouragement, and it was unreal. And I was around him all day, and he was just such an amazing person just to be
Yeah.
around.
Right.
And recognize where he came from before the military and during and afterward. It was night and day, and you would never have known if I had just walked away and never heard that part of the story. I'd been like, oh, that's a nice guy, man. Hey, he's really cool. He has it
Right.
all together. You would never have guessed.
Right.
And I think you're absolutely correct. Seeing that difference was remarkable. And not knowing that. So
Yeah.
I look at this world, and this world is broken. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, we know that just from being a Christian. I mean, that's just kind of that's just one of the fundamentals of understanding that the world is broken, because it is the world.
Yeah.
But when I look at it seems like the increase of craziness that has happened in this world, and I don't know if some of that has to do with, the access to information that we did not have 20 years ago. I don't know, but it just feels like it's tremendously worse. From
Yeah.
your experience of trauma and the recovery of people in trauma, and you see this part of the world on it, do you see it as a trauma response, that they're responding to trauma negatively, and they're spiraling downward in more trauma producing activities, or do you see it as something completely separate? And take the spiritual component out of it, because I recognize
Yeah.
there's also
No.
a spiritual component to this too.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a question that's essentially, I would say 3 nights a week, what we talk about at my dinner table. My
Okay.
kids are, I think it's a complicated question. Let me start by saying a recent survey asked Americans, um, all things considered, do you believe things are getting better or worse? And only 1 out of 6 believed that things were getting better. Everybody else believed that things were getting worse. And so, with that in mind, that essentially means that 5 out of 6 people um, believe that in spite of the government programs, in spite of the church's programs, in spite of the fact that there's 4,000 new nonprofits launched a day or whatever it is some crazy number. Despite all of the aid and the giving and the fact that we're giving away more money than we've ever given, and we're doing more programs we've ever done, despite all of that, the things are just getting worse and worse and worse. No wonder the result is hopelessness. I mean, what other,
Right.
especially if you take the faith out of it, right? I mean, you're basically
Right.
saying, despite all our best efforts, everything's just going to crap.
Yeah.
And it's true. I mean, one in four people now is diagnosed with a mental health condition. One in three college students takes a daily mood altering medication. One in five girls, one in, I think, 18 boys is sexually abused before the age of 12. More than 52,000 people took their life by suicide last year. The statistics, there's a 25 to 30,000 person shortage of clinicians to even meet the current demand. That's not, that's especially hitting rural and underserved and middle class and poor populations worse than anyone else. You've got a lot of data basically to show that things are getting worse. I would argue that you also have some data that's not very often talked about because fear sells, anger sells far more than compassion, right? We have the lowest illiteracy rate that we've ever had. More people in the world read today than ever before. We have the longest lifespan that we've had in the world in history. We have less poverty and less hunger, people dying of hunger than ever before. We're on the path to slowly eradicate AIDS from the world. We're solving, my point is there are these steps that we're taking that are beautiful and wonderful. But I would say, why is it so much more prevalent today? I think that's threefold. And I told you all that to tell you this. One, what we focus on grows as people. If someone asks you, how are you doing? Most people will always find a problem to share. Human nature. Just
Right.
weird. How are you doing? You were doing just fine up until someone asked you, and now they asked you, and by the end of lunch, you're super depressed because you've got this massive problem you weren't even aware of, right?
Okay. I go with
So
that.
that's I think the first thing is that we are more in tune with our own feelings, and we are more self-absorbed than we have ever been in the history of the world, in America, at least. And so our problems are growing partly because we're paying so much freaking attention to them all the time, constantly doing a self-inventory of, am I okay? Am I okay emotionally, spiritually, mentally? Am I getting enough self-care? Am I getting enough life balance? Have I gotten my rings in for my day? We have a watch that literally guilts us into basically saying you're not sleeping well enough. You're not getting enough steps. You're not eating well enough. It's not enough that we just feel okay. We have to have a watch tell us that we actually are okay. Right. And so this idea of this self-inventory is creating a fracture of our minds because we were never meant to live that way. We were never meant, and this is why many parts of the world who are less privileged are outperforming us in terms of happiness, in terms of progress, in terms of education, in terms of hope, because they don't have the luxury of being so self-focused. Section two is, I would say, the advent of digital technology through social media combined with pornography is created a situation where you have a entire generation of kids whose innocence is stolen at the youngest age ever in history. And I don't mean just a little innocence, I mean all of it. That's not even counting the fact that a huge portion of them are sexually abused at a young age now, which I believe is perpetuated by social media and by pornography. So I think that's the second thing. And the third piece is we're also spiritually bankrupt. Everywhere we go, we see women who have been broken and men who are in bondage, and they're being told that the answer's everywhere else except for in surrender. And ironically, the only victory that we find is when people, through humility, surrender and say, I'm not the answer. I'm not the answer. And so it's ironic that you only find victory through surrender, which is counterintuitive to culture. And so, yeah, I think those three things, that's what we talk about a lot. But that self-inventory is something, if you have kids, watch it.
Yes.
Well, it is a constant demoralizer to constantly be asking, am I okay? It's not the way it was designed. If you would have asked Jesus, notice that Jesus never talks about his mental health.
Right.
The man was homeless and poor. And Paul was in prison. And Paul learned to say that in all things I've learned to, he says that rejoice in my suffering. He says that he's found the secret to being content in all things. it wasn't this mountain valley of up, down, constantly assessing where he was, constantly asking, am I okay? Am I not okay? What's going to happen here? It wasn't that. He found contentment, and it wasn't through self-focus. It was through mission focus. It was through focus on the world. And therapists would say that that's a substitute drug that will end, and I'll debate that all day long. But I think to answer your question, I don't think it was a simple question. Therefore, I don't think it was a simple answer.
No, you're good. So there's a couple of things that I think is, what Paul says about the contentment, it's in Philippians 4,
Yeah,
11
13.
and 12, somewhere right around there. But it really, in my opinion, that whole verse starts with 4:6, where he talks about, don't be anxious for anything, but with prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. It starts with thanksgiving, and it starts with our attitude there. And then you look at Peter, later on, and when Peter's talking about cast all your cares on Jesus because he cares for you. But the verse before that is you have to humble yourself before God. We can't cast our cares until we have an attitude of humility, and that pride just jumps in the way of it all the time. And it's hard. I would say it's probably my biggest sin, is dealing with pride. It's probably, and I think it's very difficult.
It's mankind's sin.
Yeah, true. But those
It's
feelings, I talk with a lot of teenage girls, and I have to say all the time to them, and my daughter is a teenager as well, and I have to say to her as well, your feelings may be real, but they're not necessarily true.
right. And they're not permanent. They're gonna change.
Yes. And
They're gonna change.
and when you're a teenage girl, they change on an hourly basis.
No comment. No comment. Yeah.
Well, that's because yours are getting right about that point. You gotta.
Yeah, no comment. Well, I'm lucky. I have 3 boys, so
Oh, that's right. You do. It's
you're
all
unlucky,
boys. I
but
thought you had a girl in there. So,
yeah, no.
well, okay.
But yeah,
We're kind of getting toward the end. So what's kind of first of all, the final message, and then let's talk about how they can find you, get more information, how they can start, because how they can find out about getting a program to their area, all that stuff. So just kind of summarize everything for us on it, because this is such an incredible program, and you literally turn everything on its head, and it makes sense. And that's the sad part about it, is it makes so much easy sense. I call the show Uncommon Sense, because common sense isn't common, but you made it uncommon, and it's incredible. So how can they find out more about this?
yeah. So first off, like I said, if you want to be a part of this, you don't have to have a PhD. You don't have to have a counseling degree. If you've lived through some stuff, whether you're a veteran, or first responder, or anybody else, you can lead one of our 3 programs. You can start a group in your church, in your community, in your basement, VFW hall, wherever it is. We want a group there. There should be a reboot group in every city. And the reason is that there's hurting people in every city, and you can be a person who jumps in the water with them and swims to shore with them. You can be that person, and we'll equip you and train you to do that. So they can go to rebootrecovery.com and click on lead and do that. On the flip side, if you're like, man, some of what this dude's saying is clicking with me, one of 2 things. If you're ready to join a group, go to rebootrecovery.com, click on join. You can either find a course near you, or we offer virtual courses by time zone. So you could just pick a virtual program that will be people spread out across the country. But if you feel more comfortable in that, you can do it. And then third, if what I'm saying is making sense to you, and you go, man, I don't have the bandwidth to this, but I think that our program's very clear in that you can sponsor one person to go through our program. It's $300 a year, $25 a month, gets them through the program. And that gives them everything that they need, including the meals, the childcare, the curriculum, the aftercare, et cetera. And quite literally, you can participate in that redemptive process. And it's pretty cool too, because it's not like a sponsor the child thing where you're going to get a letter every month, but you are going to actually get a letter from a graduate that you help make their healing possible. And it's pretty special to get that letter, because you're going to get to see, just as Peter heard live, you're going to get to see the transformation story. And that's a beautiful thing. And you can do that at rebootrecovery.com/donate. Otherwise, if you just want to read about more and you want to academically understand, go read Healing What's Hidden. It's actually, I think, a pretty good book. We put our whole life into it pretty much. It's 13 years in the writing. Published it through Revell and Baker Books. So go check that out on Amazon, and then find us on social media at Reboot Recovery. That's it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Evan. I appreciate it. Again, keep doing what you're doing, and it's amazing. Like I said, I've I've seen it. I've seen it grow. It is an absolute incredible program. I'm not just saying that because it's you. I'm looking at other ways that I can help partner with you on this too. It's just it's so incredible, and we need to do something. And I'm glad that some people are like you out there trying to do something and trying to help. And
Mhm.
not, and you're right. You're not making it about you, and that's what's just so incredible and so amazing. So.
If it's about me, we're doomed because I can promise you that. I don't want it to be about me. That's too much pressure. I can barely keep my three kids alive and fed half the time with three boys. I feel like there's always blood. Why is there always blood? Always. Always blood.
They're getting used to trauma early. Maybe that's what it is. So
Yeah, no kidding. My kids are going to be so trauma informed. I mean, it's we have to like really be careful because Jenny and I be like, oh, we didn't realize you were listening. We should rewind that tape a minute. It's like a little heavy for my 11-year-old, especially who's tracking stuff. So anyway, we always have to be careful. So, but thank you for having me on this show, and I hope it was a blessing to you and to everybody who listened.
all right, thank you so much. I appreciate you.